So thank you everyone for attending the National Farmers Union's webinar series NF University. Our presenter today is Dr. Naomi Oreskes, and the topic is From DDT to Climate Change, How Warnings About Environmental Hazards Have Been Ignored, Dismissed, and Disparaged. Despite the pressing reality of anthropogenic climate change and ongoing environmental destruction, misinformation and apathy continue to thrive in Canada and across the globe. Dr. Oreskes explains the dire situation and the result that has come of this, and the long history of corporate power and efforts to undermine climate action and scientific truth. Dr. Naomi Oreskes is the Henry Charles Lee Professor of the History of Science and affiliated Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Harvard University. She's the author of 8 books, including Merchants of Doubt in 2010, and the just released book, The Big Myth, How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market. She's also the author of more than 150 scholarly and popular articles. Dr. Oreskes, please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. I just need to, I'm not at the beginning of my slideshow. Let me stop this and start from the beginning. Okay, there we go. Great. Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you today, especially because it gave me the opportunity to revisit some older work on history of DDT, which I think is really important work and really, really relevant to anyone who's interested in sustainable food systems, thinking about how we move away from damaging persistent pesticides to more sustainable and more equitable food systems. So for more than 100 years, scientists have been sounding alarms on environmental and health issues arising from, sorry. Is there any way to turn off? I'm getting all these notifications on my screen about people joining. Is there any way to turn that off? If not, I'll ignore it. In any event, okay. So scientists have been sounding warnings on environmental and health issues arising from modern industrial society and modern industrial agriculture. And these are just 3 examples here. Alice Hamilton, who was one of the first scientists to raise alarms about lead and its effects on the environment, Rachel Carson, who you've all heard of, and James Hansen, the climate modeler, who was one of the first people to say that man-made climate change was underway. To many of us, these scientists are heroes who help warn society and protect innocent people in the natural environment from the harms of lead poisoning, of persistent pesticides, and of climate disruption. But it's also the case that these scientists were attacked, harassed, and vilified by people whose economic interests or political ideology was threatened by the scientific facts. Alice Hamilton was attacked by the gasoline industry. Rachel Carson was attacked by the pesticide industry and also by industrial agriculture interests. James Hansen has been attacked by the fossil fuel industry and by libertarian ideologues opposed to government regulation of industry. Today, I'd like to present some of the history of these stories that I have worked on, a history that shows how and why scientific warnings have been repeatedly disparaged by vested interests in efforts to prevent policies to protect consumers, farmers, workers, and the natural environment. So as many of you know, in 2010, Eric Conway and I published the book, Merchants of Doubt. We told the story of how a group of elderly Cold War physicists cast doubt on the scientific evidence regarding a set of public health and environmental issues. The issues were the harms of tobacco use, the risks to children, infants, and others of secondhand tobacco smoke, the problem of acid rain, which greatly affected Canada, the risks associated with stratospheric ozone depletion, DDT, and climate change. By the time we wrote the book, most of these issues were settled from a scientific standpoint. That is to say, no credible person denied that there were real and serious harms associated with these issues, and steps had in fact been taken to address all of them. Well, all of them but one. One of these issues was not settled, and that was the issue of climate change. Many leading politicians in both the United States and Canada, so think of George W. Bush and Stephen Harper, many politicians question the scientific evidence of climate change, and they question the integrity of climate scientists. Business and conservative newspapers routinely published articles and editorials disparaging climate science and denying the threat of climate change. Now, in many ways, this was very odd because both the United States and Canada were signatories to the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that convention was, of course, based on climate science. As early as 1979, the US National Academy of Sciences had concluded that, quote, a plethora of studies from diverse sources indicates a consensus that climate changes will result from man's combustion of fossil fuels and changes in land use. In 1908, Jim Hansen had testified in the US Congress, based on research done by his team at NASA, that he and his colleagues were 99% certain that anthropogenic climate change had now become detectable. So it was no longer a prediction about the future, it was something that was actually happening in front of our eyes. The same year, 1988, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was created, and 4 years later, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed, which explicitly invoked a science-driven framework for political action. Article 2 of the Framework Convention committed its signatories to, quote, stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system.
Dr. Oreskes,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Our interpreters asked if you could just speak just slightly slower.
Oh,
And
okay.
we'll certainly give you a little bit more time at the end if you don't get through it all. So don't feel the need to rush. Thank you.
Thanks for reminding me. I should remember that in French, it takes 25% more words to say the same thing. I know that because my books have been translated into French and they end up longer. So thank you for that reminder. So as I was saying, Article 2 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change commits the signatories to, quote, stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And at that time, there was political will to do this. Nearly 200 world leaders signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. One of them was the US President George H.W. Bush, who called on world leaders to translate the written document into, quote, concrete action to protect the planet. So in our book, Merchants of Doubt, we tried to answer a number of questions. First, why did the United States back off its commitment to act on the scientific evidence of climate change? And second, how did challenges to science play a major role in this story? So to answer that question, or those two questions, we step back to look at the larger history of climate science. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was in fact the culmination of more than a century of scientific insight, going back to the work of John Tyndall in the 1830s, who first established that carbon dioxide was a greenhouse gas, all the way through to the work of my colleague, Charles David Keeling, who first started the systematic measurement of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in 1958. By the mid-1960s, scientists had communicated to political leaders that climate change was a real and serious threat. In 1965, the US President Lyndon Johnson said in a speech to Congress, "This generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels." As I've already mentioned, the state of the science was summarized in 1979 by the US National Academy of Sciences as a consensus that climate change would in fact result from burning fossil fuels. By the mid-1990s, around the time of the Framework Convention, climate scientists had broadly concluded that anthropogenic climate change was underway. In their 1995 report, the IPCC declared, quote, "The balance of evidence suggests a discernible human impact on global climate." Now, the IPCC was not ahead of the curve. In 2004, I undertook an analysis of the scientific consensus or the scientific literature in order to determine whether or not that IPC statement was consistent with what rank and file scientists had been saying at the time. And I showed that it was. I showed that by the early to mid 1990s, there was a broad-based expert consensus that man-made climate change was in fact underway. Yet, despite the commitments of the UNFCCC and the century and a half of science it was based on, the world had not taken any meaningful steps to stop climate disruption. Now, there are, of course, many reasons why the world has failed to act on climate change, and some of them are not particularly mysterious: inertia, vested interests, money, power. But there was one aspect of the problem that did seem a bit mysterious. Why scientists would challenge well-established science? Because what we found in our research was that some of the key climate change deniers were themselves scientists. In fact, we found that since the time of the UNFCCC, a small handful of so-called or self-promoted dissenters have challenged the scientific basis for concern, insisting that the scientific jury was still out. And what we found through our research was that this challenge could be traced back to the work of three men who in 1984 created a think tank called the George C. Marshall Institute. These three men were all prominent physicists who had played a major role in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s in building the US Cold War arsenal. One of them was Robert Jastrow, an astrophysicist and head of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, part of NASA. Another was Frederick Seitz, the president of the National Academy of Sciences in the 60s, a president of Rockefeller University, and in later years, a consultant to the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Corporation. And the third was William Nirenberg, a nuclear physicist who had worked on the atomic bomb and the longtime director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. In 1984, these men were all retired from what had been their previous jobs, and they created a think tank called the George C. Marshall Institute. Originally, the Marshall Institute was created to challenge the scientific opposition to Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. This is what most of us know as Star Wars, the idea of putting laser weapons in space to knock out incoming Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles. The vast majority of American scientists opposed this initiative, but Jastrow, Nirenberg, and Seitz supported it. So they created the Marshall Institute to defend SDI. But within just a few years, they had shifted to challenging the scientific evidence of the reality and harms of climate change. So why? Why would these distinguished scientists disparage the work of their own colleagues and reject the evidence of anthropogenic climate change? Well, it took us 5 years, and we found the answer by looking at who these men had worked with and what other science they had challenged, because we found that it wasn't just climate science. We found that they had challenged the science related to acid rain, related to stratospheric ozone depletion, related to secondhand smoke, and some of the people we had worked with had challenged the science related to the harms of radon and asbestos. But perhaps the strangest part of the story and the most revelatory involved the persistent pesticide, DDT. And the challenge to the scientific evidence of the harms of DDT and the legacy of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. A major part of the answer to our question was found in the history of Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. Now, as many of you know, Silent Spring, first published in 1962, so wait, how many years ago was that? 60 years ago, is considered a classic of modern environmentalism. It was serialized in the New Yorker magazine and became a bestseller. Carson became one of the most famous and admired women in the United States, and the book was widely credited with launching the modern environmental movement by calling attention to the risks of the indiscriminate use of chemicals in the environment. The book provided a major impetus for the establishment of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and it led to a major review by the President's Science Advisory Committee of DDT and other persistent pesticides, which led in turn to the decision to ban the use of DDT in the United States. And even today, 60 years later, it is one of the best-selling environmental books of all time. And a decade after it was published, DDT use was banned in the United States. Now, the decision to ban DDT use in the United States was not based on the book Silent Spring. It was based on the scientific evidence in the book, the evidence that Rachel Carson had effectively gathered and articulated. This evidence came from a wide variety of scientific and empirical sources. It included thousands of peer-reviewed scientific articles, numerous reports from federal and state agencies such as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, reports of harms from farmers who had used DDT, going all the way back to its earliest use right after World War II, review by the President's Science Advisory Committee, review by the U.S. Department of the Interior, and review, of course, by the newly created Environmental Protection Agency. The decision to create an EPA and ban DDT had widespread bipartisan political support. And some of you will recognize American President Richard Nixon on the left-hand side of this slide. But despite this overwhelming scientific evidence, which persuaded both Democrat and Republican officials, Carson and her work were viciously attacked by the pesticide industry and by industrial agricultural interests. Now, happily, this story had a happy ending because action to control DDT was taken despite these attempts to discredit her and the science on which she had based her arguments. And since 1972, further scientific study has amply corroborated these early concerns. And I think it's worth looking at this because there are people out there today who will say, oh, we don't really know, or the regulations got ahead of the science. But in fact, we do know. We now know beyond any reasonable doubt that DDT is highly damaging to wildlife because it disrupts reproductive processes. It posed a major threat to the American bald eagle, and today that mechanism is understood, that DDT is an endocrine disrupting chemical, even at very, very low levels. It's also a bioaccumulator. That means that modest amounts of DDT in the environment can accumulate in body tissues and reach rather high levels, even if the amounts in the ambient environment are relatively low. And because of this, DDT can make its way into mammalian breast tissue, including the breast tissue of dairy cows and humans, and it has been found in human mother's milk. And as most of you know, it's extremely persistent. So even today, 60 years after, or 50 years after DDT use was banned in the United States, we still find evidence of DDT poisoning in fish, in birds of prey, and even in people. And what about people? One of the controversial questions back in the 1960s was whether or not DDT harmed people. In 2005, The Lancet, one of the world's leading medical journals, reviewed this question and concluded that when used at levels required for mosquito control, DDT exposure is associated with significant impacts on human reproduction. These impacts include increased rate of preterm births, low birth weight, and possibly birth defects, a shortened duration of lactation and early weaning, which is associated with higher infant mortality, and clear evidence of higher infant mortality. Now, a major argument in the 1970s was whether DDT caused cancer in humans, particularly breast cancer. This question was hard to answer because of the long latency effects. That is to say, when we're exposed to carcinogenic chemicals, we don't get cancer the next day, but we may get cancer 20, 30, 40, even 50 years later. So in 2007, this question was answered by a very clever study undertaken at the University of California, Berkeley. A group of scientists studied reproductive aged women who had been exposed to DDT in the 1950s and 60s when they were teenagers, and then examined their later mortality and morbidity from breast cancer. And the results showed a 5-fold increase in breast cancer among women who had high levels of serum DDT or its metabolites. So this proved beyond any reasonable doubt that DDT was and continues to be dangerous to wildlife and to humans. The abundant scientific evidence that Rachel Carson collated in the 50s and 60s has been corroborated by many further studies. We now have more than half a century of accumulated and consistent scientific evidence. And yet, despite all of this evidence, starting in the 1990s, so 30 years after Silent Spring was published, there were a set of widespread attacks on Rachel Carson, on Silent Spring, and on the decision to ban DDT use in the United States. And in some ways, these attacks were even more extensive and more vicious than the original attacks back in the 1960s. And these attacks did not just raise questions wondering about the evidence, and they were not revisiting the issue in light of new evidence, which would be a reasonable thing to do scientifically if there were new evidence. They claimed that the ban on DDT was a mistake of historic proportions, that millions of people have died unnecessarily from malaria caused by, quote, hysterical overreaction to DDT, that Rachel Carson has blood on her hands, and even the accusation that she personally is guilty of genocide. One of the major players in promoting this attack on Rachel Carson is the American libertarian think tank, the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And you can see on this slide, their slogan is free markets and limited government. So they push the idea of free markets and that government should not engage in the marketplace, even to protect us from a dangerous chemical like DDT. So one argument published in 1996 claimed, quote, as it turns out, Rachel Carson was wrong. Over 30 years after Silent Spring's publication, a wealth of scientific evidence suggests that many of the concerns Carson raised were unfounded. The Cato Institute, another libertarian think tank linked to the Koch industries, claimed that banning DDT was disastrous, that no scientific study has been able to replicate a case of actual human harm from DDT. And another website, something called the Connecticut Commentary, claimed that DDT was a wonderful, magical chemical. Malaria, they claim, kills a child every 12 seconds and 250 adults every year. The banning of DDT, they claim, constituted genocide, quoting Arthur Robinson of the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine. And I should just say here, the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine is not an institute of science and medicine. It's actually an anti-scientific institute that has been very active in climate change denial. So the overall argument that these people made in these attacks was that millions of people die every year from malaria, that these deaths are entirely unnecessary because they could have been prevented by using DDT. Therefore, these deaths constitute genocide. Therefore, Carson is personally responsible. Therefore, she has blood on her hands. And therefore, she is a mass murderer, worse even in some of these attacks, they claim, worse than Hitler or Stalin. Steve Malloy runs a website called junkscience.com. He's someone with long and strong links to the tobacco industry. And he wrote, it might be easy for some to dismiss the past 43 years of eco-hysteria over DDT with a simple never mind, except for the blood of millions dripping from the hands of Rachel Carson, Environmental Defense Fund, and other junk science fuel opponents of DDT. And obviously, the use of the word hysteria is an obviously sexist attack on Rachel Carson as a woman. Michael Crichton, the great novelist, wrote a novel called State of Fear, in which one character in the novel insists banning DDT killed more people than Hitler. It was so safe you could eat it. And Thomas Sowell, a leading Black conservative associated with the Hoover Institution, wrote, there has not been a mass murderer executed in the past half century who has been responsible for as many deaths of human beings as the sainted Rachel Carson. I think I'll just keep going. And so I could repeat these examples almost inevitably, other websites claiming that it was the worst crime of the century. So, and just one more example. It's not just the right wing, though, that has picked up on this idea that banning DDT was a mistake. Even mainstream media like the New York Times have repeated this claim. So in 2004, the New York Times ran a column by a MacArthur fellow, Tina Rosenberg, who wrote, "What the world needs now is DDT." So this all raises the question, is there any basis to these claims? Was Rachel Carson wrong? Were her warnings incorrect? Was the science junk science? The simple answer to those questions is no, an emphatic and clear no. First of all, the ban on DDT in the United States did not apply in Africa or anywhere else. Other countries were perfectly free to continue to use DDT in malaria control, and some still do. So whatever did or didn't happen in Africa or in Asia or in Latin America was not because the US decided to ban DDT in the US. So the whole claim about malaria in Africa is a complete red herring. It was whatever was done in Africa was independent of the decisions that were made in the United States. In fact, in 1971, the EPA administrator, William Ruckelshaus, specifically stressed that US manufacturers were free to continue to manufacture and sell the product for disease control overseas, and that his agency would never presume to, quote, regulate the felt necessities of other countries. In other words, the use of DDT was banned in the United States because we didn't have a malaria problem, and it was being used indiscriminately in agriculture. But it was still manufactured for many more years, and it could and was used and to be sold in Africa for malaria control. So whatever subsequently happened in Africa or anywhere else, it was hardly Rachel Carson's fault, or William Ruckelshaus, or Richard Nixon for that matter. But the fact is that peer-reviewed scientific research has overwhelmingly showed that DDT does harm ecosystems, and it does harm the people eating in them, not by eating it, which was a complete red herring, but by disrupting development. So one thing we've learned from this story is that our conventional notions of toxicity had to change. Some poisons kill you when you ingest them, but other poisons can kill you when you ingest food that is contaminated by the poison, or when it's absorbed through your skin or your bloodstream because it's in products that you put on your skin like sunscreen. The scientific evidence also shows that DDT is not and never was a magical chemical. By now, I think we should have learned that there are no magical chemicals, that chemicals by the very virtue of their power, even when they can do good, can also at times do harm. DDT use was phased out or greatly decreased outside the United States because it stopped working well, because mosquitoes had evolved resistance. And this is the bottom line. People in Africa did greatly cut back on their use of DDT, not because of the ban of DDT use in the United States, but because mosquitoes were evolving resistance, and therefore it was no longer working in malaria control. The World Health Organization and the US Center for Disease Control have stated this explicitly, and it's extremely easy to find this information. So anyone who claims otherwise is deliberately ignoring information that is readily available to them. And so one document we found from 1976 explicitly explained that the global malaria eradication campaign, which ended in 1969, so in other words, 4 years before the US ban on DDT in the United States, quote, did not achieve its stated objective, primarily because the disease vectors, in other words, mosquitoes, developed resistance to the pesticide. So fully 20 years before these attacks, the scientific community had already observed that DDT was not a magic chemical, and in fact, it had largely stopped working of its own accord. But meanwhile, it was still poisoning birds. The World Health Organization has explicitly said that a major additional cause of DDT no longer working is the inappropriate use of anti-malarial drugs, which contributed to widespread resistance in the malaria parasite. In other words, the overuse or the inappropriate use of anti-malarial drugs, again, which has nothing to do with the banning of DDT use in agriculture. Now, I just want to emphasize and stress that malaria is an extremely serious disease. I am by no means discounting its severity. The World Health Organization concludes that about 1 million people continue to die every year, mostly in Africa, from malaria. But these deaths are not because of Rachel Carson or the banning of DDT. They are because of the basic fact of evolution, that mosquitoes and other parasites evolve faster than we can invent new pesticides or drugs. So who were all these people attacking Rachel Carson and claiming falsely that DDT was a magical chemical, that it was banned, and that this ban amounted to genocide? Well, if you look at all these people that I have cited, these are names that all appear in our book, Merchants of Doubt. Every one of these individuals and groups have also been involved in climate change denial. In fact, these are groups and individuals with a long history of attempting to challenge scientific evidence, from the harms of tobacco to the reality of climate change. In other words, there's a very strong, conspicuous pattern. I probably don't need to go into all these details. I think you probably get the point. So what is going on here? Why did these groups and individuals try to reopen a 50-year-old scientific debate, a settled scientific debate, with claims that were easily shown to be untrue? And why were they the same people who denied the scientific evidence of the harms of tobacco, of acid rain, of CFCs, and of global warming? Well, all of these groups, the Cato, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the Hoover Institution, are all dedicated to the defense of free market capitalism. You saw that slide that I showed a few moments ago from the Competitive Enterprise Institute with its logo, Free Markets, Limited Government. They all opposed government regulation of the marketplace. Many of them have ties to the tobacco industry, and all of them are heavily funded either by regulated industries such as tobacco and fossil fuels, industries that are worried about being regulated like the cell phone industry, or by libertarian foundations such as the Koch, Olin, Coors, and Smith Richardson foundations, many of which, interestingly enough, trace their money back to the oil industry. But what they all share in common is the ideology of market fundamentalism. Free market fundamentalism is an end member of neoliberalism, focused on deregulation and releasing the so-called magic of the marketplace. It came to prominence in the early 1980s under Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom and Ronald Reagan in the United States, and was pushed heavily in Canada by the Harper administration. But it's not just conservatives, Tories, Republicans, and European-style liberals who have promoted market fundamentalism. It was also promoted throughout the 1990s in the so-called Washington Consensus that was led by the US Democratic President Bill Clinton and UK Labour leader Tony Blair. Through the 1990s and 2000s, right up to the global financial collapse of 2008, there was a widespread and largely bipartisan consensus on the virtues of deregulation. So where does this come from? Well, the intellectual roots can be found in the work of two key thinkers. One of them is the Chicago School economist Milton Friedman and his book, Capitalism and Freedom. And the other is the Austrian economist Friedrich von Hayek, considered one of the founders of neoliberalism, who wrote the 1944 book, Road to Serfdom. And this history is the history that we now tell in our new book on the history of market fundamentalism. So in my new book with Eric Conway, we tell the story of market fundamentalism, how it was promoted by conservative, anti-union and anti-government business leaders from the early 20th century to the present. So together our two books, Merchants of Doubt and Big Myth, explain how and why science became a target, because science revealed that market fundamentalism was wrong, that the free market actually had very high costs, that modern capitalism had an Achilles heel, and that Achilles heel was what economists call the external costs, the damage that is done by legal products sold in free markets like tobacco or DDT or fossil fuels. But still we come back to the question, why attack science? One could be a principled conservative One can believe in the power and efficacy of markets, but also accept the scientific evidence of the harms of DDT or tobacco and the reality of climate change. One could, like President George H.W. Bush was, be an advocate of market mechanisms to solve these problems. In fact, President Bush did this when he implemented emissions trading to control the acid rain that was hurting farms and forests and lakes and fisheries in the United States and Canada. But instead, pretty much ever since Rio, the free market advocates have pursued a strategy of doubt mongering, of doubt and fear, to sow doubt about the science in order to prevent people from acting on it, and fear of what acting on the science would lead to, that it would lead to government control, not just of that specific product, but to our markets in general, and from there to our lives. Fear that acting on the science would lead to government intrusion, not just in the marketplace, but in our personal lives as well. Now, this may seem like a strong claim, so it's important for me to give you evidence. And we have a lot of it. The new book is more than 500 pages long, but I think it's shown most clearly and most succinctly in a debate that took place around the same time as the attack on Rachel Carson over secondhand smoke. For this, I need to introduce a fourth figure in the Merchants of Doubt story, this man, S. Fred Singer. Like the other Merchants of Doubt, Singer was a Cold War physicist. In fact, he was the proverbial rocket scientist. He was the first head of the US National Weather Satellite Service. And like the others, he was involved in campaigns to challenge the scientific evidence of acid rain, of global warming, and of the ozone hole. In the early 1990s, Singer worked with the Philip Morris Tobacco Company to attack the US Environmental Protection Agency over the issue of secondhand smoke. In 1993, he wrote a report with a lawyer, a man named Kent Jeffries, who was a lawyer for the Cato Institute, called EPA and the Science of Environmental Tobacco Smoke. And here I have a little funny anecdote to tell. So at the time, people were mostly referring to this problem as the problem of secondhand smoke, but the industry decided they didn't like that term because, after all, Americans don't like secondhand things. So they decided to try to give it a name that would sound more friendly. And so they called it environmental tobacco smoke, except that was a fatal mistake because it invited the scrutiny of the Environmental Protection Agency. So the tobacco industry hired Singer and Kent Jeffries to write a report. The report was not published by the tobacco industry because one of their strategies was to try to hide their involvement by recruiting third parties to do the dirty work. So it was published by a think tank called the Alexis de Tocqueville Institute, which claims to want to defend democracy in America. But if you look behind the curtain, you find that all of the funding for this report came from the Tobacco Institute, which was the alleged research arm, but actually a propaganda arm of the tobacco industry. So it's funded by the tobacco industry. So Singer was a physicist, Jeffries was a lawyer. So why did they write this report? Well, the EPA had a scientific advisory panel that had concluded that environmental tobacco smoke was a Class A or proven carcinogen. They concluded that the scientific evidence showed that there were about 3,000 additional lung cancer deaths in America every year from secondhand smoke. So that's in addition to the deaths among smokers. As many as 300,000 cases of bronchitis and pneumonia in infants and young children of smokers, and that it was statistically correlated with an increased rate of sudden infant death syndrome. This is a fact that is even little known still today. When the peer review panel issued its final report, it found the overall assessment of risk to children to be on the conservative side. So in other words, these numbers, if anything, were on the low side. And on the central question of whether environmental tobacco smoke was a proven carcinogen, the committee was, quote, unanimous in endorsing this classification. In other words, there was no scientific argument, no scientific dispute. Everyone agreed that environmental tobacco smoke was a carcinogen and that it made infants and children sick and in some cases killed them. This evidence was supported by over 6,000 diverse independent peer-reviewed studies. So why would a physicist challenge it? Why would any scientist challenge this overwhelming scientific evidence? And why would anyone defend a product that killed infants in their cribs? Well, fortunately for us, Fred Singer answered that question in his own words. He wrote, "If we do not carefully delineate the government's role in regulating dangers, there's essentially no limit to how much government can ultimately control our lives." And this is the central argument of these people. And it's the same argument that Milton Friedman and Friedrich von Hayek make in their work, that if you allow the government to become engaged in the marketplace, even for a seemingly beneficial thing like protecting infants and children from secondhand smoke, you're on the road to serfdom. You're on the road to totalitarianism, to communist dictatorship. And indeed, throughout contrarian writings, we see the allegation that environmentalists are really socialists who want to control our lives. They refer to environmentalists as watermelons, green on the outside, but red on the inside. The prominent conservative commentator, George Will, has called environmentalism a green tree with red roots, which is actually completely incorrect factually. I'm actually sitting here today at the Rockefeller University, named after John D. Rockefeller, one of America's most famous capitalists. And actually, John D. Rockefeller was one of the founders of the American environmental movement. And then there's Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma, who has threatened to indict climate scientists for conspiracy to lie to Congress and being part of a liberal conspiracy to bring down global capitalism, to which I always respond that scientists should be so organized. And they claim that as socialists, environmentalists, and environmental scientists have a hidden agenda. And that agenda is anti-business, anti-free market, and anti-technology. So here's one example from an article that Singer wrote explaining why he had opposed the science related to the ozone hole. And he accuses his enemies of having a hidden agenda of their own, not just to save the environment, but to change our economic system. Some of these coercive utopians are socialists, some are technology-hating Luddites, and most have a great desire to regulate on as large a scale as possible. So this image of scientists as sitting home trying to figure out how to regulate the economy. So what we see in all this is that these debates were not about the science. They're not arguments about the evidence or the methods that scientists are using. They're arguments about governance, and specifically government regulation of the marketplace when capitalism causes dangers that hurt people and hurt the planet. They were about whether government should be active or even proactive in the marketplace to limit business activities that harm people. And so in the late 1990s and 2000s, as neoliberalism came to dominance in many parts of the world, DDT became a target because banning DDT was the original environmental regulation in the United States. It was one of the very first things that the EPA did when it was created. And so the challenges to the banning of DDT, the attacks on Rachel Carson, the attempts to rewrite history are all part of an attempt to undermine not just environmental regulation, but to undermine the validity of government action to redress market failures in general, whether that failure is death from tobacco or climate disruption. And this is also, though, why DDT is so central for these arguments, why what might seem like something that has not much to do with climate change or tobacco is actually central to it. Because if you could show that the most famous thing the EPA ever did, banning the use of DDT in the United States, if you could show that was a mistake, that it was based on a fallacy, that it was junk science, then you could undermine the credibility of the EPA as a whole. And you could weaken political support for government action to address the failures of capitalism broadly. And this is why we argue that the same people who claim that global warming isn't real or doesn't matter, or that there isn't a consensus about among the experts, also claim, equally counterfactually, that DDT was a magical chemical, because it's the same people who want us to believe in the magic of the marketplace. So to conclude, I leave you with this thought: Rachel Carson is an American hero, and she was not wrong. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Oreskes. That was a wonderful presentation. Fantastic. Thanks for presenting that to the NFU today.